which will greatly help their transition into adulthood.
Question number 5, Grant Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Finance. Is it still a fundamental purpose of his government to close the wage gap with Australia? If so, has the gap got smaller or larger since his government came to office in 2008?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr Speaker, yes, it is an important measure for this government to improve the after-tax take-home pay of New Zealand families, including relative to Australia. Since the end of 2008, take-home pay in New Zealand has grown twice as fast as in Australia, thanks to wage increases, lower inflation and tax reductions. We will continue to ensure hard-working Kiwi families can get ahead and receive the help they need to raise their children or save for a home.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, Grant Robertson.
This is a question on notice. It has 2 parts to it. The second part asked very simply if the gap had got smaller or larger. Mr Joyce spoke about what happened in New Zealand, but it didn't do the comparison that the question asks for.
I thought the Minister responded by saying that the after-tax take-home pay had I think I accept the point the member's making. I'm asking the Minister has addressed what's happened in New Zealand, but the question is, how does that compare with Australia? I'll invite the Minister to complete his answer.
Well, Mr Speaker,
the Honourable Stephen Joyce.
If I could repeat, I've said to the member that since the end of 2008, take-home pay in New Zealand has grown twice as fast as in Australia, thanks to wage increases, lower inflation and tax cuts.
Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
Supplementary question. Can he then confirm that the gap in gross average weekly earnings between New Zealand and Australia has grown by $62.64 per week from when his $62.64 per week from when his government came into office to the end of December last year?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr Speaker, no, I can't do that. If you compare the OECD data between Australian and New Zealand average wages in 2008 versus 2015, which is the latest data available, that shows we have reduced the after-tax wage gap with Australia by 6% in New Zealand dollar terms. The gap is still too large, but it is heading in the right direction.
Order. Point of order. Grant Robertson.
Mr Speaker, I seek leave of the House to table a table provided by the Parliamentary Library comparing New Zealand gross average weekly earnings with Australia between 2008 and 2016, showing a $62.64.
The paper's been well and truly described in light of the answer. I will put the leave for the House to decide. Leave is sought to table that information. Is there any objection? There is none. It can be tabled. Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
Does he recall former Prime Minister John Key in 2010 using exactly the calculation that I have just tabled, gross earnings on a purchasing power parity basis? And is he saying that John Key was wrong to use that measure?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr Speaker, the measure that I have used is an after-tax measure, which most people would consider as the most important. We'd have to ask Mr Key, who was in Parliament at that time, but the gap that I have shown to the member is the after-tax gap, which also takes into account the movement of exchange rates between the two countries. But don't listen to me, Mr Robertson. Listen to the New Zealanders and Australians that are moving to New Zealand for work instead of moving to Australia. They're probably the best and smartest people in this regard. In 2008, New Zealand lost a net 35,400 people to Australia. In the year to February this year, we gained a net 1,000 people. They're voting with their feet.
Supplementary then, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary then, Mr Grant Robertson.
So is the Minister saying that the only reason he was ever interested in closing the gap between Australian and New Zealand wages was because of migration, and he doesn't actually care that New Zealanders are working harder than ever but not seeing the benefits of it in their wages?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr Speaker, the member is just wrong. He's just fundamentally statistically wrong. If he goes and has a look at the OECD data and converts the wages in Australia and New Zealand to New Zealand dollars in 2008 and 2015, he will see the gap has reduced by 6%. And on top of that, Mr Speaker, if he then adds a look at the employment rate between New Zealand and Australia, he will see that in New Zealand, nearly 67% of adults are employed, and Australia it's only 60.8%. So the gap is closing. More people are actually in work in New Zealand than in Australia, and therefore more people are coming to live in New Zealand rather than the other way around. But he would be mistaken to think that the last part is the cause. It's the response to the improvement.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
So, in 2010, when John Key stood in this House and proclaimed that the wage gap between Australia and New Zealand was getting smaller, using exactly the same gross average wage data that I'm using today, the Minister is saying he was wrong. And why doesn't he just admit that the gap has got bigger under his watch by more than $60 a week?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Well, Mr Speaker, I appreciate the members probably spent the whole of the last 10 days with his calculator trying to work this out, but he can stats parse all he likes. I have checked the data in after-tax terms, New Zealand and Australia in terms of New Zealand dollars, and I'm sorry, Mr Mallard, you'd have to go and have a look at the data too. The simple reality of it is...
Order. Order. I need somewhat less interjection from my left and from my right. Further supplementaries? Question. Order. 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 Question number 6. The Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Mr Speaker, this question is to the Minister for Primary Industries.